Oh, hello. This is Wade Frazier. This is March 27th, 2026 at 11 a.m. So I am going to do a series of posts on Brian O'Leary and our relationship. And so this is something I'm Brian's biographer. In fact, his only one, at this point. Kind of like Ed Herman's own biographer. I Both men deserve professional biographies of their lives. Until then, my work will have to do. And Brian, there's a lot to ground to cover with Brian and our relationship, and this is going to take a number of videos. We'll see. I don't know, three maybe, two, four. I don't know, somewhere in there probably. So this will take a while, and this post here will be on Brian's life before he had his first paranormal experience, and so this was fact most of his life. So he didn't have that till he was 39 years old. But his greatest adventures were after he had his first paranormal experience. And so without further ado, I'll start this off. So Brian, he was born in 1940 in Boston to a conservative Irish family. They voted Republican. This kind of stuff. And Brian was the youngest of three children, and Brian was gifted in mathematics. My guess is Brian had the typical genius level IQ that so many of my pals have. Yeah, so Brian was a bright boy, and he quickly took an interest in astronomy. And then when he was 8 years old, in fact, it was on the night that Truman beat Dewey in the 1948 election. Brian's parents took him to Harvard to look through the telescope there at the observatory, and that was the line of demarcation that pretty much, from that day on, it was assumed that Brian would become an astronomer, which he did. And then not long after his encounter at Harvard, Werner von Braun began publishing articles in Collier's magazine, and there are also articles, I believe, in Life magazine on space travel and landing men on the moon and even Mars. So yeah, so von Braun was sort of this evangelizer of space travel. And this is in the early 50s. This is before anything ever several years before anything ever went up into space. Von Braun was writing about it. And to a young boy like Brian, he just ate it up, So yeah, he read and reread all of von Braun's articles about space exploration and going to the moon, going to Mars, this kind of stuff. Von Braun, for those who aren't quite familiar with it, he ran the Nazis' V2 missile program. And, they they killed about 20,000 people. Concentration camp inmates were about 20,000 of them were killed to make the rockets. And then the rockets were actually mainly used on civilians, used on cities and stuff. So you really didn't have much of a military use. It was just to terrify the populace. And so, yeah. So big crimes were committed by von Braun and friends. And the level of their crimes actually was all covered up, did not become public until after von Braun died, actually. In fact, an officer in the SS, in Hitler's SS. And so this is something that yeah, was all covered up until after he died. In fact, but the Teflon effect wore off in that Arthur Rudolph was his sidekick. And he was eventually chased back to Germany, though. He was expelled from the United States. And von Braun, and this is one of the many overlaps in my life with Brian and the milieu. So von Braun was actually the landlord of one of my college roommates. In fact, my college roommate's still alive. And so, yeah, his dad was a rocket scientist. And so, anyway, so von Braun was his landlord back in the 60s, so late 60s, when von Braun was a national hero in the United States. And then Brian in high school, there was one of his classes. He was assigned to write an essay about things that we thought would be historically significant. And anyway, Brian actually wrote an essay on space satellites, and this is actually a year before Sputnik launched. And so his teacher and his classmates were scratching their heads at this really weird essay that Brian had written. So Well, the next year, it wasn't so strange the next year. So Brian was a little ahead of his time. And Brian was he was an achiever. So he was a big achiever type. So he became an Eagle Scout. And his parents expected him to become a naval pilot. That was what the family expectation was. Uh, in fact, Brian's older brother became a Rush Limbaugh fan to kind of give a flavor of the political milieu that he came from and with his family. And then when he was a teenager, youngster, he was like 13 or something, he visited DC, Washington, D.C. for the first time and was totally overawed by the monuments. Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial. I mean, he definitely was guzzling the nationalist Kool-Aid there with his visit with Washington, D.C. And in fact, that visit led him to, he even called it a codependency. Brian had a lifelong codependency with Washington, D.C. And again, my accompanying post here really just more or less gives the outline of what I'm discussing because there is so much to discuss with Brian. Um, but Brian had this pattern that lasted pretty much his lifetime, where he would go to Washington, D.C., full of fire and idealism and wanting to make a dent, wanting to make the world better. And then he would get into the soup in D.C. to slowly become disillusioned and then to flee D.C. And after a couple of years of looking at his wounds, he'd be back for more. He did this several times over his lifetime. Yeah, so he couldn't quit DC. That was again a codependency with DC. But by the end of his life, he was kind of over it. So, in fact, soon before he died, he informed me that electoral politics in the United States was a dead end, and he would have known, which I'll get to soon. So Brian, when he got out of high school, he attended Williams College, which was at the other end of Massachusetts. So he got away from home and he joined the free thinking crowd. And this was again in the late 1950s. In fact, one of his roommates wrote the novella The Graduate, which they made that movie out of with Dustin Hoffman, et cetera. And Brian, he discovered the adult world in college at Williams. So he was living a wild life and drinking it up, discovering sex, discovering marijuana, I think. And it was only a C student at Williams. Yeah, his grades suffered as he was finding his way in the adult world. But he was still ambitious, and so he actually ran the Boston Marathon and climbed the Matterhorn during his college days. And throughout this, I'm going to highlight where our paths overlap. So actually, I've been to the Matterhorn. So I went to the Matterhorn. My only trip to Europe, I actually went to the Matterhorn. It was one of the places I went to when I was in Europe. I lived in Boston. So this is many overlaps in my journey with Brian. And Brian graduated in 1961 and then moved to DC to work for NASA. Got a job at NASA and then attended Georgetown, studying astronomy and going for his master's. And after a couple of years, he actually wrote a satirical play on the faculty that a fellow student who actually worked for the CIA had leaked to the faculty. So they basically booted Brian out of Georgetown while handing his master's diploma on the way out the door. So, and then Brian taught math for a while there in inner city DC, to poor black people, poor black children, etc. And I don't know all the details behind how Brian started really moving and going to high places. So in 1962, he actually met Bobby Kennedy at a Thanksgiving bash. And in fact, so he spent Thanksgiving with Bobby Kennedy. And actually at that gathering in 62, RFK was like rolling on the floor laughing at the Von Meter album, which was this album which had parodied the Kennedy family, which was like this big, huge international hit at the time. And so, so Brian hobnobbed with Bobby Kennedy back then. And 1964, Brian got married. So he got married, and then he decided to pursue his doctorate, and he decided to move to Berkeley. And Berkeley's where Ed Herman got his doctorate a decade before. And again, where I almost attended. So I was chasing my girlfriend. I nearly attended Berkeley. again, the next decade. So yeah, many overlaps. And when Brian was at Berkeley, so a guy named Donald Ray, who was a scientist who eventually worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory there in Pasadena, uh, he took Brian under his wing, and they began publishing scientific papers on planetary science, basically, and especially Mars. In fact, Brian wrote his doctoral thesis on Mars, on the Martian surface. And so, and the papers they wrote and were published in scientific journals, it wasn't just any scientific journal. So it was Science and Nature, which are basically the two most prestigious, science journals in the world at the time. And so, yeah, so Brian really hit a scientific stride under Ray's mentorship. And then in September 1966, as Brian was wrapping up his doctoral studies, his thesis, he saw an ad on a bulletin board that announced that NASA was looking for scientists to become astronauts. And so, anyway, so Brian, I mean, his childhood dream was about to come true. And so, and then when he saw that ad, and this is one of the many overlaps, when Brian saw that ad for astronauts, I lived in Houston. So my father works in the mission control room at NASA at the time. And so, yeah, for the many overlaps in the journey. And my father had moved. We had lived in Southern California in Ventura County before. My father worked for the Navy, but he was recruited to work at NASA. So we moved a family there in the summer of '66 to Houston. And my father worked on the Gemini 11 and 12 missions. In fact, helped them. Yeah, he was. In fact, he was such a superstar. They actually tried to ask him to move to DC in the NASA's hierarchy, and that didn't work out, as I'll get to here in a sec. So, in fact, I toured the Mission Control Room in December. This is between the Gemini and Apollo programs. My father, on Christmas break, he actually took the family. In fact, my grandparents came down. My mother's parents came down from Washington to visit us, and we all went to Mission Control Room, which was, yeah, I was 8 years old. And so that began my abiding interest in space exploration. I was visiting my father's office at Mission Control back there in 1966. Yeah, 60 years ago this year. But on January, so in the next month, in fact, January 27th, I was in Boy Scouts. I was a Cub Scout, and there was a thing called the Pinewood Derby, where, and again, the boys didn't contribute much to it, but basically their fathers built them, and was definitely the case with my father. I may have helped paint it, but he made a little wooden race car about this long, and he'd race them down these ramps, and it was called the Pinewood Derby. And so on the 27th, my pack. And then my pack, it was several hundred people. So several hundred people were at this Pinewood Derby, and my father, being the engineer that he was and technical genius, he built mine, and it came in third in the pack. And so, but at there, he didn't talk about what event had happened that day at work. And in fact, as soon as we got home, and this is a vivid memory of mine, as soon as we got home, my father rushed into the house and turned the TV on. And then, and what was on the news then was the Apollo 1 fire, which had happened that day. My father was he was there when it happened. He was, it happened while he was at work. He was actually, remote witness of it, because the Canaveral capsule was communicating with Mission Control when that happened. My father eventually heard a tape of the last seconds of those astronauts. Yeah, grim stuff. And my father really never talked about that disaster very much. But in the aftermath of that disaster, it became hyper political at NASA. Everybody's trying to cover their backsides. Nobody wanted to be culpable of what had happened. The environment became hyper political. And, my father moved from Southern California, beach towns and stuff, to live in Houston. It was like the other end of the earth. My father hated living in Houston. Rattlesnakes in your front yard, all this kind of stuff. So he hated living in Houston. And so anyway, soon after the Apollo 1 fire, my father wanted out. And by May, we were moving back back to Ventura County. In fact, we moved to Ventura, California, where we bought another house. Yeah, I lived in 3 new homes in 1 year back then. Um, but my father still lives in the house that he bought in '67. Um, and the Apollo 1 fire was really when the balloon began coming off the roads for the USA space program. Until then, so the Gemini and Mercury programs were wildly successful. They all had hitches and stuff, but American problem solving and stuff always overcame the problems. This was, in fact, Apollo 13 was kind of the epitome of that, where this human meat in these rockets came in quite handy when there were problems, because they could problem solve things. And uh, so in May, my dad was out of there, and so we moved back to California. And then only a couple weeks later, Brian had his astronaut interview there in Houston, one of our many overlaps. And Brian, his interview for the astronaut program was one of the strangest interviews in recorded history, because in that interview they ordered Brian to go to Mars, which was totally blew Brian away. He thought they were joking at first, but Brian was a Mars expert, and in fact, Brian was the only planetary scientist in the Apollo program, as an astronaut program. He was the only one, and he soon, as he eventually found out. In fact, he told me when I was doing his biography that he was the first talent in the stable for Von Braun's Mars dreams. Yeah, so they were expecting by the '80s to do a flyby of Mars, and so Brian was hired specifically to go to Mars. And so yeah, strange interview. Be asked to go to Mars back in '67. And anyway, and Brian got hired. So they hired, in fact, in July, he got hired. And so he got hired in July, and then his first day on the job was supposed to be September, but in August. So between when he got hired and his first day on the job, NASA lost a budget battle with the Pentagon. So the genocide in Vietnam had to be paid for somehow. And so, yeah, so NASA's Von Braun's great dreams, it said, all the ambitious space plans came into conflict with the Vietnam War. And so the funding got cut. And so on Brian's first day on the job, so he was one of 11. So 11 scientists, astronauts were hired in that group. In fact, it was the last hiring group in for 15 years. It's a long time. So it was the last one, because on the first day on the job, and again, Deke Slayton and Alan Shepard ran the astronaut corps. They were Mercury 7 astronauts. In fact, after the Mercury program, the astronaut program was always run by former astronauts. And so there's the guys who ran it. And the first day on the job, Deke was, the orientation for all these 11 new astronauts. And the first thing Deke said was that, well, we lost the budget battle on Capitol Hill, and we don't need you guys anymore. And so if you want to quit, no hard feelings. And so this is the first day on the job. In fact, each hiring group had a nickname. And so these guys called themselves the XS11. So, in fact, Deke encouraged everybody to quit, actually, day one, which blew everybody away, obviously. And of the 11, 4 did quit, including Brian. And then the 7 who stayed, nobody went into space for 15 years. And certainly no moon shots or Mars shots. It was just going up there, Space Lab and the Space Shuttle and stuff. Skylab and the Space Shuttle. And so Brian's roommate, so when he was there at this astronaut interview, his roommate was actually Gerard O'Neill. And Gerard O'Neill later recruited Brian to Princeton's physics department. And in fact, O'Neill was big into space colonies and asteroid mining. And Brian, he and O'Neill sort of led the effort on exploring the feasibility of, again, space colonies and asteroid mining. And in fact, one of Brian's asteroid mining colleagues, space colony colleagues, we became friends many years later because of my relationship with Brian. So obviously, on Brian's first day, all of a sudden, when Deeks, told everybody to quit. That day, the whole dreams about Mars started fading from view. In fact, I've read too much probably about the NASA stuff, but Von Braun, yeah, after we landed on the moon, he was again, Von Braun wanted to do Mars, but it was off the boards, and so Von Braun became kind of a nobody after the moon landings. Um, so yeah, so Brian was an astronaut in training, and part of the back then, in fact, all of the Mercury 7 and Gemini uh, astronauts were all pilots. They all had a pilot background, test pilots, and military pilots, this kind of thing. And so, and this was a requirement for an astronaut back because they would, in fact, they'd all get issued basically a supersonic sports cube that they had to fly like 20 hours a month in. And by I think 4 astronauts died in training accidents with the supersonic sports cube, who are guys who were test pilots, already pilots, and 4 of them died in training. And so they had done like flies back then. And so Brian wasn't a pilot; he was just an astronomer. So it was part of one of the scary things about the whole thing was pilot training. Eventually, flying a supersonic sports cube. In fact, Brian quit soon after he started in pilot training, which I'll get to here. But before Brian began there, when he signed up to interview there at NASA, I mean, his man, so Ray and other scientists that he knew really cautioned him on this because in physics, astronomy, again, science, so particularly the hard sciences, you go to Newton or Einstein or Heisenberg, all the big names of science, they all did their most impactful work when they were in their 20s and 30s. And this is how it is. And this was like they were at peak brain performance to be able to do that, and they hadn't been captured by their paradigm yet. So the big breakthroughs among scientists, and again, this is a normal thing where scientists in their 20s and 30s, that's when they're making their mark. If they're going to make their mark in their career, it's going to be while they're in the 20s and 30s. And so Brian's friends were saying, you're going to give up your best years as a scientist training to be a rocket jockey, and they were trying to convince Brian not to become an astronaut. And in fact, the ones who stayed, so of the 7 of the 11 who stayed, again, not only did nobody go into space for 15 years, but pretty much they all sacrificed their scientific careers. And this is part of the price of becoming an astronaut was, they're not going to be professional scientists any longer. This is part of the deal. So anyway, so Brian, in fact, his second solo flight, where he got confused, didn't quite come close to crashing it, but he realized that it was not his element. In fact, so the next day, actually, he called up Deke Slayton and said that he was quitting. In fact, he said, "Flying is not my cup of tea." and flying is not my cup of tea became an infamous statement, which Brian was probably best known for, because it became sort of global news. In fact, Brian eventually saw flying is not my cup of tea as a Jeopardy question, a Jeopardy answer or a question. Who said flying is not my cup of tea? He actually saw himself featured on Jeopardy because of that statement. And in '65, Brian actually visited Carl Sagan at Harvard. And in fact, in Sagan's office was this big globe of Mars, which was mostly blank at the time because so little was known about Mars. But in '65, there were no flybys of Mars or anything. So it was just ground-based telescopes. And so they didn't know much about Mars at the time. And so, but by the time, so in '68, when Brian quit, Sagan had moved on to Cornell, where he was building his empire, and he recruited Brian. He recruited Brian to be professor at Cornell. And so, and then they were. And so, in fact, Brian and Carl were arguably the 2 leading Mars experts in the world at the time. They were arguably the 2 foremost Mars experts. And when they were there, they wrote scientific papers together, and they studied lunar mass cons, which are called mass concentrations, which it's part of planetary science. And in fact, Brian later was on the Mariner 10 science team. as the Mariner 10 was doing flybys of Venus and Mercury. And then Brian, because of his mascon work, actually predicted the location of and named what's called Caloris Basin, which is a big mascon, which is at one of the nodes of Mercury that faces the sun a lot. Yeah, so it's not Mercury is not tidally locked as the moon is, but it is still kind of tidally locked. And so Brian there was started teaching at Cornell, and again, but he was never far from D.C. So in 1970, in fact, when Nixon announced there was a war, the United States had been at war in Cambodia for years. It was part of the secret war. Well, when Nixon finally announced that we were at war in Cambodia, there were huge protests. In fact, that's where the Kent State shootings. That was a part of the protests in reaction to the news that we were in Cambodia. And then there was this huge protest at the White House in 1970 in Washington, D.C. And Brian was there with a couple other Cornell professors, and they were standing in front of the White House. And in fact, they were expecting to get fire hoses and dogs, maybe, but instead, what happened was somebody came out from the White House and invited him in. And so Brian, with a few of his other professor colleagues, went into the White House to vent their grievances to the Nixon administration. In fact, Brian actually tried to get into the Oval Office and was blocked. Haldeman, one of Nixon's henchmen, blocked the door at the Oval Office to prevent Brian from trying to take his protests into the Oval Office. And Brian, in fact, he later wrote that when he was at Cornell in the spring of '71. This is now 3 years into his Cornell tenure. One day there was a blizzard in May at Cornell, and Brian was raised in Boston. He had enough of Northeast weather, so he said, "I can't take snow in May anymore." So he left. So he left Cornell, and then Brian became a bit of an academic vagabond. He taught at Hampshire College, Caltech, Berkeley, Princeton, and a few other universities over the next 20 years or so. So he just bounced around. And Brian also became a NASA gadfly. So he write op-eds in the New York Times, challenging NASA on the moon landings and whether it was really, or really, what are we doing on the moon? Is it science or stunts? And he challenged the idea of the space shuttle, etc. Yeah, Brian was a big advocate for robotic probes. He goes, they can do the job. They can do the job, and you don't have to risk people. And it's a lot cheaper just with robot probes. This is largely how we do space exploration today, right? Ever since. So Brian was kind of ahead of his time there too. But his op-eds in the New York Times did not endear him to his friends at NASA. So yeah, he became estranged. In fact, I remember one of the op-eds, like the next week, a week or two later, there was a rejoinder from some of his XS11 colleagues who were like challenging Brian's challenging of NASA. So yeah, it was a lot of kind of hard times with Brian and the astronaut corps after that. Not always, but it was definitely a bit of that. Yeah, he did not endear himself to NASA, even though he worked on the Mariner 10 science team, etc. That was '74 when they flew by Mercury. So, and then Brian, once he did do the DC protest in 1970, he was on CBS News that night and stuff. It was big time, bright lights. In fact, Brian later said it sort of tended to puff up his ego. He admitted that it was kind of overwhelming for the ego to be on the national news and stuff, and rubbing shoulders in DC like he was. In fact, Ryan eventually soon went to work for Mo Udall, who was a senator who ran for president in '76. And in fact, in '76, Brian was Mo's speechwriter and energy advisor. But it was this. In fact, Mo Udall was actually the early frontrunner for the presidency for the '76 campaign. And then David Rockefeller's hand-picked candidate, Jimmy Carter, came from nowhere and became president. And his presidency was packed with Rockefeller guys. And so this is part of how the world works. And so I don't want to get too far in the Rockefeller hole today, but Brian encountered that stuff. But the grind of the campaign So Brian thought that Udall was a good guy, a really idealist, kind of like Brian, but they were surrounded with power-hungry people, which that's DC. And so, and in fact, the grind of that campaign wrecked Brian's marriage. So his marriage ended because of that, because of his campaign with Udall. And then in 1975, O'Neill, again, back to Gerard O'Neill, his roommate at the astronaut interview, he recruited Brian to Princeton. And about space colonies and asteroid mining. So this is what they were doing. And in fact, many years later, became friends with one of Brian's space colony colleagues, which he'll get his own video eventually, Michael Hyson. But even at Princeton's physics department, so the Princeton's physics department had like 5 or 6 Nobel laureates on staff, and the staff was maybe 40 people. Yeah, and like 5 or 6 of them had Nobel laureates. That was a kind of, in fact, Princeton, Berkeley, maybe one or 2 others. Those are the most prestigious, physics programs in the world. And so there was Brian, and Brian he taught physics for poets there. So he taught physics to non-scientists there. In fact, one of the favorite classes to teach was at Princeton. And pursuing space colonies and asteroid mining, that was fringe stuff, so the other Princeton's faculties, always Nobel laureates and stuff, sort of looked askance at Brian with his fringe stuff with O'Neill. But O'Neill, he ran the department, but it was considered the pursuit of space colonies and asteroid mining was pretty fringe activity, not respectable physics kind of stuff. But every 2 weeks at Princeton, at the faculty lounge, they would have a luncheon. So I think it was maybe Tuesday. But anyway, they have a luncheon for the faculty there. So all 4 of them, whenever we get together for this luncheon there, And again, this is the old money world. So they're all sitting there having this luncheon, and then after the eating, they'd all get I think you call it a thimble. Basically, you get a glass of sherry, and so all the faculty there are shipping sherry after their meal. And Brian, and this was again the beginning of the end for Brian in the scientific establishment, in that during their sherry shipping session after their meal, the number one topic of conversation was debunking accounts of the paranormal. Yeah, and in fact, again, all these Nobel laureates and stuff, you'd think that would be like strange. Like, why would they do that? Until you realize that these are the high priests of materialism who are defending their religion. But Brian, he hadn't awakened yet. So Brian was smugly shipping his sherry with him. Yeah, joking and dismissing any accounts of paranormal experiences. So anyway, Brian smugly shipped his sherry until in 1979. 1979, he actually attended a human potential class. That was called LifeSpring, which was kind of a combination of Est and Silva. And I took Est and Silva back in the 70s myself. And so I'm very familiar with what that milieu and in fact, what happened during Brian's class. And so late in the class, he was given the name of somebody. In fact, somebody said, "Okay, Brian, here's the name of this." And it was a man who lived there. And in fact, Brian was doing this in Pennsylvania, as I recall, around Philly, I believe. And so, anyway, so it was a local guy. And anyway, so Brian, and again, they were teaching people to meditate. So Brian goes into this meditative state. And then they say, "Yeah, Brian, here's this man and age, and he lives nearby. And now you're going to describe the guy." And Brian is, he's in this state, and rationally, he is like, this is a ridiculous exercise. He's realizing that, he doesn't know this. He never met this guy before. And how could he have anything accurate to say about the guy? But Brian goes into this trance, this state. And the next thing you know is he's seeing this guy. And he looked lonely. And he was actually, Brian got this guy like hanging out on the west on Maui, and that he was a meteorologist. And in fact, during this reverie that Brian was having, this guy was he was showing Brian about the weather and all this kind of stuff. And Brian knew that he was so-called making up, but it was so vivid. And he goes, "This is Yeah, he didn't know what was going on. That this was some wild fantasy or something. And so after he just goes on describing this guy and you know, this meteorology stuff and hanging out on Maui, um, the woman who gave him the information said, "Yes, that's exactly, you got it exactly. This is, yeah, he lost his wife to disease, and so he's a widow, and he loves hanging out on Maui, and he's a meteorologist." And Brian's life was never the same after that. And in fact, what that's called a remote viewing experience. And Brian did it. So he did a remote viewing experience. And 5 years earlier, I did it. And actually, I think more impressively for me, I watched somebody remote view somebody that I knew. And so they described my first employer, and she said he was missing the end of his finger 10 seconds into, you know, her reading. So it was, yeah. And when you've had experiences like that, you know, that's the knowledge of experience. You know that materialistic theories of consciousness are not accurate. They don't tell the whole story, remotely tell the whole story. And so, anyway, so Brian, it ruined him as a mainstream scientist. He could no longer ship the theory of materialism. He knew that the materialistic stories that were purported to explain human consciousness, et cetera, were fairy tales, scientific fairy tales, but they were fairy tales nevertheless. And so he knew that the story that was told in the physics faculty lounge there, you know, sipping their sherry, he knew that they didn't know what they're talking about. And that was really, it ruined Brian as a mainstream scientist. He could no longer drink the Kool-Aid. He was like, he knew it wasn't right. He knew it was far short of reality. And so this is something where, and once you have those kind of experiences, and so for me, I had my experiences 5 years earlier, and I was only 16 at the time, and I didn't know it, but it ruined me also before maybe my career even began. That to actually realize that, yeah, the materialist story of reality isn't accurate. And so this was Brian's first experience like that. And so that was the beginning of the end for Brian in the scientific establishment. And his big adventures were soon to begin, which is what's coming up in the future posts. So anyway, bye for now.